floating solar? And the answer is that just on man-made reservoirs alone, there's a potential for 4 terawatts peak of generation with just 10% of the water surface covered. So there's a whole lot of area available with good solar resource, not so much shade to generate power. So I come from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory in the US, so our data that we have is pretty focused on what's going on in the US itself. And so when we think about the benefits for floating solar, the reasons we might actually install it in the US is that, you know, we can have land energy conflicts even in a place with a lot of wide open spaces, sometimes inside a city. We actually don't have room for a ground-based array. There can be unused space that could be generating revenue. You can get a little bit higher panel efficiency, especially if you're in a very hot area, because the water will keep things a little bit cooler. In the US, we have a lot of drinking water reservoirs in very hot, dry areas, and they can have high rates of evaporation. And covering some of that with floating solar can actually help to reduce the evaporation losses from those desert reservoirs, which is a big benefit there. And again, then you can also avoid some land acquisition and other site prep costs. I'll talk about some sites in the US where maybe we wouldn't expect to see a floating solar array because there's nothing out there but cows and dirt. It turns out it's cheaper to put it on the water than it is to clean up the dirt and get the cows off. And so again, we'll talk a little bit about some of these co-benefits of floating solar and then maybe some trade-offs. If you have a reservoir, you're stuck with the reservoir you have. It may not necessarily be the ideal site that you were dreaming of to save all this money. So let's see. Some examples of the kinds of water bodies that people use for floating solar are usually not I come from Colorado where we have a lot of these beautiful, pristine, high alpine lakes, and nobody's talking about putting floating solar on any of those. We're not looking to put it in a wildlife area, we're not looking to put it in a bird sanctuary. We're looking at putting it in places like water retention ponds, which can be a bit mucky or slimy and maybe benefit from having some coverage. Water treatment reservoirs are very popular, especially in places where they may pre-treat the drinking water, and that treatment chemical can interact with UV and give the water kind of a funny taste, so actually blocking that can be a benefit. Integration with hydroelectric dams, power generating reservoirs is becoming very popular. Along with industrial wastewater ponds or other kind of gross water, or maybe you don't want birds landing on it very much. Irrigation reservoirs and some integration with aquaculture and fish farming is becoming more popular. And I'll show you an example of a large project on a quarry in Europe that just completed apparently a couple of days ago. So some key milestones for a timeline in floating PV. This is a pretty new field. We've been deploying PV in the US for almost 40 years, but floating is quite new. It's only been around for about 12 years. The first install was around 2007. And those systems in those early years tended to be pretty small. We have a commercial installation in 2008. Somebody started to try tracking in 2010. That hasn't really caught on in a big way in floating for obvious reasons, including a lot of equatorial locations where it really doesn't matter. You can be pretty flat. We saw the first megawatt floating installation around 2013 and offshore in 2014. And then all of a sudden in 2017, things really took off, with far more people adopting floating and the systems that people put in getting much bigger, including the first combined hydro and floating PV plant, and I'll show you a bit of data from that plant today. And then last year, the first 2 really big plants, 150 megawatt plants, 2 of those on coal mine subsidence ponds in China, and things picking up quickly for this year as well. So we look at floating solar around the world. It is still largely dominated by installations in Asia, growing fast in China, and now in other parts of Asia. The market in 2019, 2020 will really be driven by Korea, Southeast Asia, in addition to what has been historically the biggest market in China. We're seeing a lot of interest from Northern Europe, along with Latin America as well. Historically dominated by land-constrained areas where these other co-benefits, maybe avoiding a ground array and having some water quality benefits, increase adoption because the costs are a bit higher for floating. The capex is a little higher, operating expenses can be a little higher, so you've got to have something else to push you over the edge. As is true in any ground mount array, the costs vary pretty widely, country to country, depending on location. So Japan actually has some of the oldest floating systems and the highest rate of floating solar adoption in the world, and their costs are still significantly higher than a place like India, just due to installation costs, soft costs, permitting, labor costs, those kinds of things. The modules themselves are not a primary cost driver in floating. So I'm here to provide a little diversity from the CERS programming. However, CERS in Singapore has the best floating data, and that's the floating data that a lot of us around the world rely on, because they have this 1 megawatt test bed that gives us all performance and degradation data, and now they've got 3 years of data coming out of this thing. And so we're starting to see some really cool results that help the rest of us around the world figure out what we might want to either mimic or what we might want to do differently. There's a lot of good lessons learned that we'll be hearing about tomorrow, first session in the morning. From this, they have 8 different systems with very unique mounting configurations in each one, and some of them are performing a bit better than others, with different kinds of modules and different kinds of installations. So as is typical of most floating arrays, they have the you can see they've got the modules out on some sort of floats, and these vary from things that are very open to the water to the more common design where it's actually pretty, the panel itself is pretty well kind of blocked from the water by the floats. There's a central inverter is actually on shore, which seems to be more common than floating the inverters out in the water. Interconnect and everything is on land. The things that are different in a floating system from a ground system are really the floats, the pontoons, and then the mooring and anchoring, which we're also going to have a lot of talk about in the floating solar meeting, because it turns out that's one of the harder things to figure out how to do properly. So challenges of floating solar, some of them are quite similar to systems on land. Everything you build requires some sort of operation and maintenance support. That operations and maintenance or asset management can be done very well, or it can be done pretty badly. You know, if somebody's not paying attention and their O&M contractor is out there like standing on the panels, bad things are going to happen just like they would on land. Some unique challenges to floating solar are basically things like the cables, wires, connectors actually falling into the water. Or sinking a little bit, some separation in the floats, and we'll be talking more about that over the next couple of days. I saw a great example of how something that's relatively simple in a ground mount array of replacing a broken panel or something like that is much more expensive and more difficult in a floating system. If you're seeing a lot of degradation, it can cost you a lot to get out there and fix it. So those kinds of difficult to recover losses can cost you more in floating, and doing that extra due diligence before you buy can really pay off. So some challenges that are pretty common, these are all pictures from the CERS install, are cables and connectors touching water. It's pretty obvious you don't want your cables and connectors actually physically in the water. So when they get there, bad things can happen. Just in case, it really does make sense to go ahead and use marine grade cabling and connectors, because you can get leakage, you can get low insulation resistance, which in addition to causing corrosion and breakage, can also lead to your inverters starting late, meaning that you start generating power late, so your check starts rolling in late. And when we start to get delays in revenue, people tend to get out there to fix things. So this can be dangerous, along with looking at recommendations to do better cable routing, making sure you're matching module and float dimensions well so things can't slip off, and paying some extra attention to those design details, especially because unlike in a ground mount, your whole mounting structure can move when it's floating. It's doing this 24 hours a day. And so if there is something that can get loose, it will. As with any PV array, it can get critters. There could be all kinds of animals on a floating array. And the most harmful kind of animal to visit does still seem to be birds. Apparently they really like to leave gifts on the array, which can cause a lot of hot spots, partial shading, that kind of stuff. So those are quite harmful. And then other animals getting in and eating things and wires. So here's a very different system. This is actually the only floating system in the state of Colorado, where I'm from. Colorado is currently at my house minus 23°C right now, which is a little unusual for October, but it's very common in the winter. And so we're pretty sure that the system up in Walden is the coldest, consistently coldest system out there, and it was frozen in all winter. So I've got a couple pictures, one during the day of what it looks like completely iced in, and then at night I had a little fox visiting it. And this system has only been in operation for about a year, and many of us are quite curious to see how it's going to perform maybe next spring. It seemed to be okay this summer, but we're not sure how many times it can freeze completely, thaw out, and move around without some sketchy things starting to happen. So we expect to learn a lot from this system. Again, this is one we didn't expect because there's a lot of open, really cheap land around there. But inside the city limits, they actually don't have a lot of space. And the town of Walden wanted to put in a solar system. And so they wanted to also power their water treatment facility with this system. So it's a local consumption type of arrangement. And they also wanted to protect their drinking water a bit. So they were incentivized to spend an extra bit of money on the floating system because they got all these other perks along with it. And they also were able to do a bunch of community involvement, which does seem to be a common thread in some of these floating systems. That is a big common thread in the system. These guys will be presenting Friday? I think, on Friday. Omega 1 in Piolang, France. So I went out there last month. And this is the first non-recourse financed floating system in the world. And they actually crowdfunded 40% of the cost. They have so much support for this thing in the community. So we went there and the mayor said, well, we have this old nuclear plant. You can see the picture in the bottom there. And that's eventually going to phase out. And we have 3 big manufacturers in the city, and they each need about 1 megawatt, so we'll put in 3 megawatts of wind. And then they were able to get support for the 17 megawatt community solar plant in the middle of this flooded quarry. This is all part of a community redevelopment and big bike path initiative. And so it's really encouraging that they've been able to sell this power to the neighboring departments around this area. It's a really impressive looking plant. And when you go there, you can see some changes that they made in the float design, in the cables, and all kinds of other lessons learned that I think have really come directly out of some of the test deployments in Singapore and other places. So one big challenge for floating PV is surviving storms. We will be talking a little bit about typhoons and damage and other things, including typhoons leading to fire in Japan. There have been several systems heavily damaged. And again, these are storms we wouldn't expect a system to survive. But we want to do what we can to give it the best chance possible for that to happen. So we'll be talking a bit about these. We look more broadly at resilience. There are places that just get hit with catastrophic storms, both in the southeastern US and the Philippines and Japan, frequently. And how do you design a floating system where that is a regular occurrence as opposed to an every 25 or 50 year type of thing? Along with some very harsh environments in the Netherlands where they're looking at deploying near shore. So not actually in an inland water body like most of us have done. This will actually be out in the harbor and near the coast, but actually out in the ocean. What are they going to do for pretty regular 60-mile-an-hour winds? And other kinds of interesting cases where the water quality is maybe not good, or we have ocean water which can be very corrosive. There's some examples from India of systems in floodplains that have been pretty hard hit. So one big category of interest for floating PV are systems that are combined with hydropower. And so there's 2 different ways to do this, one of which is to actually float the panels on the reservoir because you have the reservoir there. It's not making any money just sitting there. And you can make money both off the solar generated on the water and on the water running through the turbines. And I'll talk a bit about the system. The top photo is actually in Portugal, where they have a small demonstration system doing this. And then in China, they have a huge hydro dam and a huge ground-mounted PV plant where they've got 800 megawatts of PV and about a gig of hydro. And they have this monster plant. They're separated by 30 kilometers, but a dedicated electrical interconnect. And they're able to get 0 curtailment, which is really impressive for a plant of that size. And many others are looking at developing similar kinds of combined hydro and floating PV. So talking a bit more about the plant in Portugal, because these guys were not able to come to IFSS, so I was able to get some slides from them. They had the reservoir surface available. They did have a lot of challenging with permitting and land use, so we'll be talking about that, about environmental impacts, which can slow that process down. And it was a challenging site that they picked intentionally to test these mooring designs and see if they could get this thing to work. So this is a pretty small 220 kilowatt system, but they're looking at a much larger system. So they have this existing transmission infrastructure with the dam and the reservoir. They have a reference system on land. So it's a great test site. However, the reservoir that they have has a lot of variation in water level throughout the course of the year, which can be really tough to design for. Even with that, they're seeing about a 5% efficiency gain in generation over their predicted business case, so things look pretty promising. In managing how you actually dispatch this to maximize revenue, and you have to actually make money off the whole river basin, not just the PV plant or off the hydro dam, it really requires a lot of careful local aggregation and VPP to dispatch for maximum revenue. There can be times where seasonally you get a lot of PV generation when you would have a lot of hydro generation, so you don't get the seasonal offset that you may dream of in this particular case. That may be possible in other locations. But you can essentially promise a very consistent output, because whatever you miss in PV, you can make up in hydro, which is quite good if you need to meet a certain commitment. And so they're looking to scale up with the idea that the cost should really come down as they get up towards 20 megawatts. But it's definitely possible. And looking at how much spare capacity they have versus what their generation options are to fill that spare transmission capacity. And checking out all of their options. So one of the big things we'll be talking about at IFSS is the new floating solar handbook for practitioners coming out of CERES, where we can get a lot of useful information on how to actually build, operate, design a floating PV plant with some practical guidance on things like dealing with water and reservoirs and mooring and floats and things that they've learned, and wind loads and waves. And a lot of those things we don't necessarily deal with in ground mount. And so, in summary, I'm trying to go short here because I know everybody's had a long day. Floating solar is a fast-growing segment. There's about 1 gigawatt of it out, and it's growing up fast. It has terawatt-scale potential just using these man-made reservoirs that don't have recreational or other major usage demand. The co-benefits and availability of existing transmission infrastructure are really driving adoption, especially in places that are not as land-constrained as Singapore. Obviously, in the US, if you're going to spend more than putting it on the ground, there has to be some other reason to incentivize that adoption. And the cost is rapidly coming down, but it is still higher than a comparable ground mount array, so there are a lot of locality-dependent variations. In the US, your soft costs can vary town to town, county to county, based on permitting, and it can be a bit unpredictable, especially for a technology where we don't know as much about the environmental impacts, and people are really still trying to quantify those risks. So we'll be focusing a lot of discussion on that in the next couple of days. The findings from the Singapore testbed do show a higher energy yield because the panels do run a little bit cooler. They're exposed to a little bit more wind, so the temperature is lower, which leads to slightly higher efficiencies. The constant movement does put some extra strain on cable management and connectors and anything that's going to get tired of vibrating, and that kind of slow oscillation that you get from the floating plant. High humidity means there's almost always some sort of moisture on the panels, so you can have insulation resistance issues, inverter late starts that lead to a lower availability from your plant. It's not a reliability failure, but your power's not coming up as often. And there do seem to be huge opportunities for the combination of floating with existing hydropower stations. So I will close with this. Please come see us tomorrow and Friday. We'll be talking in much more detail about all of these topics. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.